Okay, the exposure triangle clearly defines your exposure. You can have it right or you can have it wrong. Trust me on a number of issues. The first one is there are a couple of things that you must understand on the technical side. There are a whole lot of things that you can understand on the artistic side. And when you deal with the artistic side, it's always very subjective. What you love about a photograph, somebody else may hate. But on the technical side, trust me if I tell you, if the exposure is wrong, it is wrong. If it's out of focus, and it should not be out of focus, it is wrong. If you have camera shake, when there shouldn't be camera shake, and the only time that I will allow that is if there is a 1.5 ton buffalo chasing you, which happened to me. I didn't shake, I just froze. But then we'll allow it too. But guys, clearly, when you step out of the realm of just the standard average mik and druk user out there, and you get to where you guys are, we now really need to get a hold of the technical elements of this. And at this point, it is so important to understand it. The exposure triangle comprises of 3 elements. The first one is ISO, it stands for the International Standards Organization, and that clearly speaks to the sensitivity of either the CCD or CMOS that you have in your digital camera. In other words, how sensitive is your camera to light? And you can adjust it. You have all seen the little buttons ISO, and you can make it 100 ISO, you can go up to 200, 400, 800, and there's a relationship there. And you can go up, if you really get with the big stuff, to 256 and 25, 600, and even beyond that. But each one of those things would have a trade-off, and it's clearly important that we understand it as well. The other one is shutter speed. For how long a period does your shutter stay open? And the third one is aperture. In other words, that hole in your lens, the aperture, how big is it, how small is it? All of that relates to light. High sensitivity, it reacts very fast to light. A big aperture, it lets a lot of light through. And a long shutter exposure lets a lot of light through, and vice versa. So you can change it as you go. And that is one of the reasons why you have to get off auto. My metaphor, understanding this, it is like understanding a good suntan. ISO is the skin sensitivity. If you're fair, like Jenny, you burn easily, so you can't stay in the light for a long time. Aperture is like the amount of sunblock. The more you put on, the less sun will hit you. Well, it'll hit you, but it won't have such a big impact. And the shutter speed is how long do you go and lie on the beach. Clearly, the longer you stay on the beach, the worse it gets. I'm going to go through the next couple of things very, very quickly, because it's important that we understand the relationship here. ISO is the measure of the digital sensor, the sensitivity of the digital sensor to light, or the measure of the film sensitivity to light. I'm not going to go through the rest, it's very fast. What is the aperture? That is really that hole in the lens. It normally starts on the average lenses around about f2.8, goes up to f22, f32, you've all seen it. That defines what the size is of the aperture. The next one that we're talking about, the shutter speed, that is the duration that the shutter stays open. Combinations of f-stops, in other words, your aperture settings, and shutter speeds will make up your exposure for a given ISO. Now, folk, there's really an understanding and a relationship that is required with this. If you have a very small aperture, it lets in a lot of light. For the same ISO, you would have to extend the duration of your shutter opening for a specific exposure. If you reduce the duration of your shutter, you clearly would have to make the hole bigger, the aperture bigger, and therefore you would have to go to a lower f-stop. But these aren't the only two things that can affect it. You can now also go from ISO 100 to 400, which will again make it more sensitive, and therefore you can play with the other two as well. And that's why the clever Japanese guys and the very clever Germans designed all these other fancy systems like shutter priority, aperture priority, manual modes, and so on, so that you can really go out and work with it with a clear understanding of what it's going to do for you. Now, why am I saying this? I'm saying this because I'll look at the EXIF files and we will comment later, because I picked up some of the photographs, where you have, especially with Vistas now, a photograph taken at, let's say, f5.6, which does not give you a lot of depth of field, but it's taken at a 4,000th of a second. It just does not make sense. You would have been so much better off sticking it on program or auto, and the camera would have averaged it, and you would have ended up somewhere around about f11 at 1/500th of a second, and it would have been a better exposure. You would have had a lot more depth of field. But it's simply because you do not understand what the exposure triangle is all about. It is of cardinal importance that you utilize this every single time you go out and take the photograph, and ask yourself, what do I want to achieve and how will I get there? Now, the last thing that I want to touch on, because I'm sure I'm pretty close to the end of it, is the relationship and what it does. If you look at ISO and you increase ISO, who does not know what ISO is? Just very quickly. No hands? Oh, there's one at the back. Oh, it's me. There's a mirror. Damn. I wondered who the ugly bastard was. If you raise the ISO, you go from 100 to 200, we start looking at a term called stops. In other words, that's one measure of exposure faster. It becomes more sensitive. If you go from 1 to 400, it's 2. 1 to 800, 3 stops. And that equally equates to that you would have to reduce either your aperture or your shutter speed, or the combinations of them, to equate for the change in ISO. If you don't allow for it, you're stepping out of this triangle and you go to the overexposed, underexposed scenario where you're not smack in the middle and creating that perfect exposure. What's the easy way to check it? Anybody? Heard of a histogram? Go and look at your histogram. If it's fairly much in the middle, you're okay. If it's whack over to the left, it's not okay. If it's whack over to the right, it's also not okay. I say that reservedly because there are two factors called low key and high key that'll give you the same effect. So you have to be careful. I say that just so that you know what's waiting for the rest of the year and how much more you would be able to learn by understanding this and where it'll take you in your photography. Okay, if you increase your ISO to, let's say, 800, it's fantastic. You can see everything goes up. You can get more depth of field. Your shutter speeds are higher. But there's a trade-off. Once you get to about ISO 1600 or 3200, you get noise. It's called digital noise. You have little worms and little goodies on your image, and now you have to go to Photoshop and fix it and denoise it, and it becomes a mission. Best you stay out of that domain, because then you have to worry about it. So higher ISO equals more noise. If we look at apertures, the very low numbers, like f1.2, f1.4, those ones, would tell you that the aperture is very wide open. If it's very wide open, you have very little depth of field, which is great if you take a photograph of a pretty girl against a very ugly backdrop. But if you want to take a vista like we had for now, best you don't fall under about f11, because you really want that depth of field. You want to have your foreground. You want to have your background. You want to have your middle ground. You can remember the rules of composition that we had before. Very important that we understand those concepts, because it fits perfectly for this kind of thing. So the higher your f-stop, the more depth of field. In other words, f11, 16, 22, 32, great for landscapes. The lower ones, good for portraiture, where you really want to reduce your depth of field. And then shutter speed, and here I'm going a little bit wacky because I hate it. I always say your shutter speed should be as low as possible. And a lot of people will disagree with me, but with the fancy cameras that we have, the only reason why you would use 1/4000th of a second is if you have a 4000 millimeter lens on your camera. Trust me, you wouldn't do that in a hurry. There is a rule about it. We call it the rule of invert. If you use a 300mm lens, don't fall under 1/500th, because what you do is you put a 1 on top and then the length of the focal length of the lens. So if you use A 50mm lens, 1/60, 1/60th of a second would be good. At that stage, you can hand hold the camera. Anything below that, you will not have a decent picture. If you come to me and I see on an EXIF, and I see, for instance, that you've taken a photograph of f16 and it's 1/8 of a second, then my first assumption will be that you used the tripod. And if you did not, I will see it, you will see it, Rob will see it, Alex will see it, Ivan will see it, and you will see it. Everybody will see it because there will be some camera shake or blur. And that's the thing to guard against. So, there is a relationship here. Those three things must be in balance. It is a trade-off. It's your decision to decide whether you are going to up your ISO, whether you are going to increase your aperture, whether you're going to make your shutter speed faster. But it must be within the relationship of still giving you the correct exposure. And every single time you work with this, whether it's a landscape, whether it's a portrait shot in a studio, in daylight conditions, you have to ask yourself the question, what do I want to achieve? Lots of depth of field, high f-stop. That requires a lower shutter speed, all right, for that given ISO. So if I want that, I need to work around it. So I must drop my shutter speed. What happens if my shutter speed then becomes lower than the rule of inverse? I have to up my ISO. And so you have to work through every single photograph. If you're a sports photographer, you'd put the emphasis on shutter speed. Again, so you need to work with those things. You step into a studio, you are going to use manual. Why? Because you can control the light. If you do a still life, again, you check all these things out, bit by bit. Most of the good cameras have a live view. I want to know from you now, doing vistas, please put up your hand if you took your landscape through your live view, the screen on the back. Please put up your hand. Anybody who did the vista with live view. Now, I'm going to ask you one question. How do you know that you actually focused 1/3 into your image? You don't know. So it was a fluke, wasn't it? Not quite. I know Alex shakes his head because it was calculated. I see that rock, I'm going to focus on that and I'm going to recompose. Am I right? What did you do? High aperture. Of course high aperture. But you still should focus 1/3 in. That's a rule of landscapes. Try to get 1/3 in, because then you are going to cover your foreground and you're going to cover infinity. And the best way to do that is with live view. Play with these things. With a clear understanding of the exposure triangle, you would be able to do that. These are the building blocks that we will use through the rest of the year to start developing all the other things. What is a proper shutter speed for what condition? How do we use aperture control for depth of field? How are we going to play with ISO when we really can't use a flash and we want to go and photograph a band on stage? So important that we understand these things. And we're going to build on this all the time.
On a Canon camera, you set an f-stop and a shutter speed. If your ISO is wrong, does your f-stop flash?
It will flash. If you go outside your exposure parameter, in other words, it's now not going to be correctly exposed, most cameras will flash you.
Okay, which means you must change your ISO.
You must change it.
But
Yeah.
in which direction?
Up. Normally up. Yeah. It's highly unlikely unless you're going to stand on the wrong side of the moon, which is the one facing the sun, that you would have to adjust it down. That's highly unlikely.
So he's saying that is correct.
Yes. The rule for me, and that's Bert's rule number 227, is use the lowest ISO you always can. Why? Best quality. Your lowest ISO will always be your best quality. But you can't always use the lowest ISO. You have to adjust it for what you want to do. And again, your ISO is adjusted, for me personally, as the last option. I want a lot of depth of field. I do not get the rule of inverse sorted as far as my shutter speed is concerned. What do? All I do is I up my ISO. That's the logical thing. Bert's rule number 422 is if that happens, stick it on a tripod. It works best. Okay. Looking forward to working with you guys for the rest of the year. I want a lot of phone calls. I want a lot of emails. I can give you a lot of information. Alex is also on the training side and the coaching side. We are going to bombard you with stuff. Reciprocal failures and all sorts of aberrations, chromatic aberrations and all sorts of stuff. And why an aperture should be fairly round, like the beautiful Canon lenses that gives us a very nice round aperture, as opposed to the Pentax one that gives you an octagon. I lie. Thank you very much, and we'll chat just after the rest of the photographs. Thank you.